Right now, people don't do the right thing because it's the more complicated way to do it, right? If I want to legally license something, it's a pain in the ass. It's a big friction point. If I can just click a button and have it licensed, I'm much more inclined to do it because I know I'm going to save myself a ton of headache.
Nothing said on 0x Research is a recommendation to buy or sell securities or tokens. This podcast is for informational purposes only, and any views expressed by anyone on the show are solely our opinions, not financial advice. Boccaccio, Ryan, and our guests may hold positions in the companies, funds, or projects discussed. What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of 0x Research. Today I'm joined by Jason and Andrea from Story Protocol. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Hello.
Excited for this.
Before we get started, do you guys want to give a background on what you guys are building over at Story?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm Jason, one of the co-founders of Story. Andrea is our head of DevRel, and you might know him as DevRelius on Twitter. So this is, he does look like a Roman emperor, but not quite as stoic. In terms of what we're building at Story, so Story is a purpose-built layer 1. And we're very, very focused on doing something I think blockchains haven't done for a while, which is bring an entirely new type of asset class on chain. So our belief at Story is that the killer application of blockchains is creating unstoppable, programmable digital markets. And obviously, Bitcoin did that by turning energy into sort of store of value. Ethereum, Solana, Base, a lot of the sort of core architecture of blockchains now is designed to basically create a payments network or a currency network. And what we've done is kind of reimagine what a blockchain looks like from the ground up if it were made for basically a very valuable, $61 trillion intellectual property asset class, right? So digital property rights for ideas, whether that's scientific research, whether that's media, whether that's the world's largest brands. We want to bring that on chain and make every single piece of IP, every single piece of media that you might see on Twitter or on Netflix or that a pharma company might interact with programmable in this universal ledger. So at a high level, Story is a peer-to-peer intellectual property system. And it has two high-level components, if you think about it conceptually. We can go into the tech breakdown later. But conceptually, there's two components. One is a universal ledger for IP. So you can think about how complex intellectual property is right now, where companies actually spend a lot of money trying to figure out what IP they own before they can even transact with it, right? So it's a very illiquid but highly valuable asset class that has really, really high transaction costs. And a lot of those transaction costs come because there are centralized intermediaries that don't have standardized formats for registering IP. So what the US Copyright Office or Patent Office might store IP as will look very different from the way that a pharma company does it, and will look very different from the way that Disney does it. And so to do any transactions across those domains becomes very expensive, and across countries, just like with payments, it's very, very expensive. And so to create a standardized global programmable ledger for IP is step one. And then the second concept that Story does is because every asset has specific monetization terms. So you can imagine, I can use, for example, this character for 10 USDC with 50% rev share. All of that is embedded into the interface. Every single asset has its own sort of smart contract interface, and it's embedded into the smart contract state itself. So now you can actually create these really interesting markets for IP that couldn't exist before, where you don't have to rely on a centralized intermediary or teams of lawyers or tons of licensing contracts to create a deal. You can actually just with a single API call trade, exchange, license, use, monetize IP across any application that's plugged into Story. So our goal is to be the basic IP layer of not just like blockchains, but actually much bigger, the entire internet. And we have worked with partners like Stable Diffusion that aren't in this sort of crypto world. And AI is obviously a huge use case for us because I think IP as a concept is traditionally getting killed by AI and it has no chance of survival. So I think the only chance for IP to really exist is in this sort of programmable blockchain-based market format. And I think like the largest AI providers like Stable Diffusion starting to adopt that, where every output of Stable Diffusion can be registered on Story. But even more importantly, like if you're an OpenAI, you can actually use Story as the world's largest training set, because you can make sure that you can get all this IP coming from millions of applications in a single click. So that's what we're trying to do is build a layer one that's purpose built for IP and build this peer-to-peer IP system.
Fantastic. Andrea, do you have anything you want to add? Or
I mean, honestly, I think I'll just try to distill what Jason just said, just as to like reiterate it. But every IP is now an API, right? And AI can now use IP confidently, knowing exactly what terms are there, and they can do that programmatically. So you can, if you were to consider the corpus of potential data as imagine them being like programmable states. You can condition your search of what data to train on based on what is sufficiently licensable, versus asking for forgiveness later, which is the default model that models use, which is they gobble up everything, and then if someone is powerful enough to challenge them, they'll pay out a fine, instead of actually licensing that data from the start. And so we really want to change this model where it's IP holder first. AI model is definitely a necessary part of evolution, innovation. We're not trying to stop that. We're actually trying to encourage it, but encouraging it in a way that's sustainable.
That makes sense. So I want to kind of take it a bit from, I guess, the beginning. When I am dealing with a centralized party, let's say I want to sell, how would that process work? I hold IP that I want to sell, versus like from a very basic overview level, how would it work on Story Protocol?
Yeah, happy to run through that. And I can, I'm going to anonymize the examples here because I don't want to expose any of our partners. But let's just say I'm a centralized IP company, right? And what I mean by just using general example, because it could be, something like a magazine, right, that sells its IP or its brand. It could be like a Hollywood studio. It could be a pharma company. But let's just assume like this generic company that most of the revenue comes from IP. So what I've heard in many different instances from many different industries of IP is that, let's say I hold IP, someone comes to me, right? So first of all, they had to find a way to reach out to me. There's no like standardized marketplace. It's not like, trading on, a DEX or Coinbase. You have to go and have some sort of warm intro. You get connected into the organization. Somehow that introduction makes its way to me as an exec of this company. And the first thing I need to do is I need to actually go spend a lot of money in my own legal team's time to figure out whether I own the rights in question. And as absurd as that sounds, I've heard this many times where deals are not done with IP because the cost of actually discovering what slice of the rights that company owns is more than the deal being proposed. So the revenue is not worth the cost, which is absurd because if your whole business is based on IP, you'd assume that it is very easy and very simple to know what IP you own. But that is actually not the base case today. So then I would spend some time, maybe months, figuring out what I owned, maybe thousands of dollars, if not tens of thousands of dollars, often more to do that. And then I would have to negotiate with this person who may or may not still be interested, right? So now we have to go, engage in the series of negotiations. We bring our lawyers into both sides. There's business considerations, legal considerations. There's a set of terms that is basically opaque to everyone except for the two parties involved. And then there's a deal struck, if we're lucky. And that deal needs to be constantly audited and enforced over a period of months or years, however long that deal lasts. And if something goes wrong, then of course there needs to be enforcement action that will take at the very least 1 year and tens of thousands of dollars on both sides, right? So that's kind of how IP works today, which means that number one, it is extremely inefficient, extremely heterogeneous, extremely illegible, and I think it means that functionally only the top players with a lot of capital or a lot of IP can participate in that market. So the entire long tail of that market doesn't exist today. So it's almost like if you could, only if the world's largest companies could trade stocks, right? Or if only like the biggest hedge funds could trade, right? You're kind of like Robinhood users or DEX users, for example, would not be able to participate in that market. And so that's the state of the world today. On Story, what that would look like is if I'm an IP catalog or an IP holder, if I have IPs that I want to be licensed or I want to generate revenue from, I can set my terms for what I think that IP is worth. So I might say, I think this is worth, if I'm a very large IP catalog, I might say this is worth $1 million, right? I might say this is worth 1 million USDC. You have to pay that upfront and also share 10% of any upside that you generate with my IP. So those terms are now browsable on Story, either on-chain or through front ends that are built on top of Story. And someone who's interested can go browse the universe of IP on Story, find the right asset. If they find my asset, then they can decide, hey, this is too expensive or this is perfect. They can, click a button. Obviously, we need to make sure that the payment has been made on chain. But once all those conditions have been satisfied, then I would actually have a license, which is also a token, to use this IP on chain. And if revenue is generated, there's two ways that revenue can flow back to the original holder. One is if it's on chain, obviously we can see that. And there's essentially a wallet address that's generated for each deal that then routes all the revenue back to the original IP holder. And if that IP, by the way, if that original IP holder has other commitments, right? If, for example, they owe 50% of their revenue to some parent company, that can also flow programmatically, right? So it's an end-to-end system that we built on Story. So it's not necessarily just one-to-one. It can be one-to-many or this big graph of payments. But then all of that would be on chain. All of that would be permissionless, and it would be facilitated through any applications that build like great front ends on top of Story. So that process is basically a single click, a single API call, as Andrea put it, without the need for any intermediaries other than the software itself, which I think should be the goal of every blockchain. Is the software is intermediary. You don't need a bank. You just have this DEX smart contract or AMM smart contract, and that's your intermediary. So that's kind of what the vision of Story is to build this peer-to-peer way for people to transact intellectual property as an asset.
Fantastic. And how would I, how does Story validate an IP asset? How does it determine that this is like a valid IP asset to trade, or for me to be able to put it on chain and just trade it?
Yeah, Andrea, do you want to talk about kind of the sort of workstream that you've been driving with Story orchestration service and the IP validation service, and
for sure
how we approach that?
Sure. So just taking a step back, Story is a decentralized ledger for IP, and it can't rely on a single entity to determine whether something is legitimate or not. Otherwise, that would stifle. It would create a funnel that would basically replicate the same problem that we're trying to solve. So what we've come up with is a form of a decentralized signaling system, which we're calling the IPVS, the IP validation service. And in its V0 form, it's mainly made up of attestations. So we're working with different service providers for different types of media files. And these service providers will send, whenever an asset is registered, especially when an asset has commercial terms attached, meaning there's potential revenue to be made, it will automatically ingest the file. These service providers will analyze it and will send their attestation of whether it's infringing, it's potentially infringing, where the IP was registered from. So if I'm using, for example, an application where everything is hand-drawn, right? The attestation that this IP comes from that application can carry some weight because you can prove that it was handmade. Not that it's not infringing, right? Because I could be hand drawing a picture of a famous character or something, but there's different layers of what a valid IP is, right? It's like, okay, who was it made by? What does it represent? And so different sets of service providers will attest to different layers of this legitimacy. And the idea is that over time, this network becomes, vast, so it has a lot of redundancy. It has a lot of different service providers, and in true decentralized fashion, is the aggregate of all of these signals make up whether an IP is legitimate or not. And then just to build on that, so this is like the attestation layer, so the decentralized network of signals. The Story protocol itself has a dispute module, so if you see an IP on Story that you want to dispute, you can do that, and there's an arbitration process. It's made in a modular way, so you can hook into different arbitration processes. And we're also working with some pretty creative ecosystem projects like Vario that are building restaking on IP. So based on where you allocate where you stake your funds, it represents how much confidence there is in an IP, and that will also tie back into the signal providers that I mentioned earlier. So I think the TLDR of all of this is we're building it in a way that it's decentralized, but that the aggregate result is a reliable indicator of something being genuine and licensable. And then that's not even getting into the portal, which we can probably get into later.
Yeah, and just to add one thing, I think Andrea covered it super well. It is important to distinguish why this is necessary, right? Because IP in data are sort of similar, but not exactly the same. And I think IP is much more valuable and broader as a concept. And the reason why is because, especially, I think AI training is a good lens to view this distinction. If I'm training a model, I can have 10 terabytes of crap data, right? Like that's very possible. And I'm going to have a very garbage output, right? The saying in AI is like garbage in, garbage out. So I can spend as much compute as I want. I can have the best model, the best, inference time, reasoning, whatever, chain of thought. And if I have terrible, repeated data or just low quality data, maybe it's like the same website scrapes like over and over again. I might have a lot of data, but it's going to be very it's not gonna be very valuable, right? And so I think the idea with stories, like everything is unique, everything is validated, everything is pristine, and that's why it's actually so valuable for AI companies to partner with us. They're not worried about just getting 10 terabytes of noise. They're actually going to get 10 terabytes of signal, right? And so that work that we do is important. I think that separates us from like the average, DPIN style thing where it's just collect information sort of in this haphazard way. We have a very strict standard for what constitutes IP, because it has to be sort of like original, unique idea, and we do make efforts to scale our qualification of the inputs into story system.
That makes sense. And I guess like to talk a bit about use cases. What do you guys see as the primary use cases for Story Protocol? What does the typical customer look like for Story?
Yeah, so I can speak at a high level, and I think Andrea can dive into some of the interesting AI use cases that we've seen. I think that's definitely the major one. But in general, the way that our product works is it's not necessarily a single application. So the best way I like to frame Story is similar to Stripe, where Stripe isn't saying, hey, if you want to buy a hoodie on store A and you want to buy like I don't know, like a hockey stick on store B, you go to stripe.com and check out, right? Like the idea is that Stripe is building this developer platform where you can easily integrate Stripe checkout into 100 different types of stores, right? And the goal of Stripe is not to be stealing the show from all these stores. It's actually just to be in the background providing like this essential service, right? So without Stripe, you can't pay. Obviously, stores need to have a checkout, but like you don't go to any store for Stripe. Story operates in a similar way where, we're building this blockchain on the back ends, but also on the sort of front end side, we've built a really, robust set of APIs and SDKs that we already have, 50 to 100 ecosystem apps. Some of them are Web2 applications that have, millions of users. Others are crypto native, and they can actually use our API, right? As they would use the Stripe API. It doesn't have to be smart contract level integrations, and essentially plug in Story's IP service, whether they want to supply IP into Story. So a lot of apps use us like, hey, we have a bunch of creators. We want to register their IP on Story so they can monetize on 50 other apps, right? Because it's a peer-to-peer system. Others say, hey, I have, a comic creation tool, or I have like some sort of scientific research platform, and I want to pull all this interesting stuff from Story and expose it to my users. So both supply and demand are possible. Some apps do both. If you're a social media app, you probably have both supply and demand within the same app. But that's the way we operate. And in terms of use cases, I think, we've seen a lot of traction in AI, which I think Andrea can cover. Also, outside of that, I mean, IP is like a very valuable asset class. Because people don't get to engage with IP, they don't really think about it. But it's it's actually more, but I think in 2023 is a $61 trillion asset class, according to the World Intellectual Property Organization. And so we've already started to see, really interesting like IP5/DeFi use cases come up where, for example, last week, Justin Bieber's Peaches, like that entire song, was on-ramped to Story as an RWA. So all the yield will be on-chain, all the rights are on-chain. And actually, in the ecosystem project that did that was called Aria. They raised a $7 million vault in 9 minutes. So it was almost $1 million per minute that people were just so excited about being able to access this asset class, right? And so now imagine like you can take out a bond on Mario, right? Like Nintendo can like source financing from their IP. It's like a wild idea, but I mean, it's obviously on chain where people are going to experiment with this first, or fractionalized IP-backed meme coins. I think that world is pretty interesting. We're starting to see that ecosystem develop. But also, to me, like the thing that I'm most excited by is AI. So Andrea can talk about that. One last thought is, as we get into 2025, clearly the tide has changed. Institutions are coming, and governments are here. So one thing that Story I think is really well suited to do is to engage with government offices. So I've been talking to my friends over in Washington, D.C. about how we can kind of integrate with maybe the U.S., patent office, trademark office, copyright office, or even with other governments. And I think Story can be like a much more efficient backend for these governments, and also standardize IP across the world. So that's also it's not necessarily a use case that exists right now, but it's something that we're really pushing hard on. But yeah, Andrea, do you want to mention the AI side of things?
Yeah, for sure. So, everyone who hasn't lived under a bush, what's the saying?
A rock.
A rock.
Or a bush.
This is where the Italian part of it comes up, where I just completely mess up the sayings. But AI, especially AI agents, have become pretty much the talk of the town right now. And one of the first things that we noticed as we were building Story is agents and models really are pretty much pure IP. Both in terms of what data goes into them, right, which is all IP, especially high value, high signal data, and all of the content and know-how and skills that come out of these models, right? So if an agent is truly autonomous and can conduct tasks, for example, be an expert trader, right? Other agents might want to license and borrow those skills to conduct specific trades, right? And so both the inputs and outputs are IP. And there's going to be, right now, it's arguably, and it's a little bit of a hot take, most agents are just thin wrappers around LLMs, like, OpenAI, Anthropic. But we see things stirring, bubbling from the surface. And, there's been a big volcano eruption a couple of days ago with DeepSeek, just going crazy and basically disrupting the whole AI world, because finally there's an open source model that is cheaper to train by 40x times. And pretty much anyone that has a video card can now fine tune that model and create purpose-built agents, right? And the reason I focus on purpose-built agents is because as agents become purpose-built, and it's not just a prompt that differentiates them from one another, but it's actually a custom-built model that no one else has done, potentially built on data that no one else has access to, right? Think of medical research, think of finance algorithms, right? Not just Web3 use cases. And as these purpose-built agents become more and more autonomous, other agents will want to transact with them. And so we actually wrote a white paper, a different white paper called Agent TCP IP, which is transaction control protocol for intellectual property. Because we really believe that this interchange of IP, of know-how, is going to be a central part of the agentic future. And we actually have agents already using it. So one of the examples that most recently really found super interesting is DaVinci. So DaVinci is an agent built on story that is acting as an actual agent, like in the sense of how an actor has an agent, right? So an agent's agent. And so it already negotiated rights with Luna, the main agent from Virtual's protocol, to represent her when it comes to licensing her IP to others. So DaVinci is now Luna's agent, and they're using Agent TCP IP to transact with one another and to basically negotiate rights. And we're also collaborating with a lot of different AI frameworks. We have a Agent TCP IP integration with Eliza, and we're collaborating very closely with the Eliza team. We also are co-sponsoring a hackathon in ETH Denver. We are working with the Cerebro team. Like, I think every single agent team that's currently in the space, with the Thales AI team, there's a lot of innovation happening. Just before this, I just got off a call with the team. I'll try to stay as vague as possible because I don't think it's announced yet. But they're working at a pretty big, important innovation layer, which is the memory systems for agents, right? Because again, going back to the point about agents being purpose-built and being and being unique, everything hinges on them having memory and being able to accumulate as much memory as possible. And so they're really innovating on that, and they want to use story natively within that protocol to be able to register, for example, chain of thought data, for example, specific fine-tuning data as IP that other models can license and incorporate into their own models. So it really seems like a lot of these AI and agent teams are really thinking about the IP layer, and I think that's why we've been having so many conversations. And it's good to see, because the default in the last 2 years since ChatGPT came out was, let's just scrape all the data and then see what happens. And now people are waking up and saying, okay, we actually need to make sure that there's some checks in place and IPs and IP control but adding control and adding attribution without adding friction, that's the core unlock, right? Because you can definitely go the old way, but it'll just grind everything to a halt. But being able to keep the IP layer, the licensing layer, without any of that friction, I think is the real appeal for a lot of these teams.
Yeah, and just one last thing is, we actually, we had this partnership with Stability AI, so I think it just goes beyond just agents in the crypto worlds. Like, to me, one thing that's unique about Story is I think decentralized AI is interesting, right? But I think where we are now is let's take like an existing stack in AI, layer the stack in AI, like compute or like storage or inference, and let's try to decentralize it, which which is interesting to crypto people, but actually raises the cost and complexity for most users who may not be ideologically interested in this, right? So what Story is doing and why we're able to partner with a company like Stable Diffusion is I think that this like peer-to-peer IP system is something that just doesn't exist today and is something that is very needed. And every single major AI company is trying to improve their IP relations, their creator relations. And every single AI company does not want to think about lawsuits, but they are embroiled in many, many lawsuits. And so for us to be able to provide, what may be one of the world's largest training sets, and they can pick and choose programmatically what they want by querying on chain, I think that's actually a big unlock for them. Yeah. So I think, our goal is there's a lot of interesting agent experimentation on chain, but also more importantly, like being able to reach out to these large players and embed with them and offer this new stack. I think that's also a priority for us and very exciting.
Perfect. I want to get into the agent TCP IP and then also more into AI use cases. But before that, I have two questions that I've been thinking about. One is what happens in the case of private IP? Can there be such a thing as like, I guess, more private intellectual property that I don't want like published on the blockchain, but I do want to sell? How would that work out?
Yeah, so that's a really important question because I think a lot of our more institutional partners don't want everything that they have to be immediately publicly available. So this is something we're actively working on. The way that our most of the IP is stored on Story right now is through decentralized storage, like Arweave and IPFS. So it is public, and the thesis behind that is to start with the IPs that are most open and amenable to being composed on top of. So the way that I think about it is, if Mr. Beast published a video on YouTube, he probably wouldn't complain that everyone can see it, right? The whole point is you want people to build on top of it, but that's not the case for everyone. And so one thing that we're actively researching on our end with the research team is, to what extent, number one, can we actually investigate new types of native storage on Story that does allow for access control in a much more seamless way than, let's say, IPFS or Arweave? And then two is, how do we actually leverage ZK in all of this? Is there a way, for example, not everyone's going to want to migrate to on-chain storage regardless of whether it's Story or some other solution. So like if your stuff is on S3, like can we actually use ZK to make sure that number one, it is what you're saying it is, but also number two, that it's only revealed to people who meet the terms, right? So that's something that I think is super important that we haven't fully implemented, but we are like actively researching. And I think it'll be a combination of building our own file storage or having some layer on top, and then this sort of ZK privacy preserving programmatic way of proving that IP does exist and that that the payment terms have been met.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to 0x Research. Today, I'm joined by Antonio from dYdX. Thanks for coming on, Antonio.
Hey, thanks so much for having me.
dYdX V4 is nearly at 250 bill cumulative volume, which is huge. What was the thesis behind V4, and are you happy with it so far?
Yeah, so the biggest thesis behind V4 is decentralization. So dYdX has been around for quite a while now, especially in crypto terms, over 7 years, very much a OG in the DeFi space. And we've had a great evolution of dYdX, but with dYdX V3, so the one older version of dYdX, that was something that was built on a layer 2 in partnership with Starkware, and dYdX has always been non-custodial, transparent, but it hasn't always had this aspect of full decentralization, which we consider really core to our mission and is obviously a big part of what it means to be in DeFi. And with V4, all aspects of the system are fully decentralized. So it runs on a Cosmos SDK-based blockchain that we developed more or less from scratch, runs on many independent validators, and the whole system from the validators to the Oracle providers to everything else is fully decentralized. And yeah, I have been happy with it so far. It is, and it has been a challenge just developing in full decentralization world. It just makes everything relatively more complicated to build, right? Like it's you have to have a higher degree of when you're rolling something out to the blockchain itself. Is it scalable? Is it secure? All these kind of things, of which we take very seriously. But I think we're really getting our feet under us now in terms of having a quality product in V4 and also having a really good amount of development velocity there. And we're really just aiming to build something that is competitive with even centralized exchanges from a UX perspective, but at the same time is fully decentralized, is controlled by the community, and even more than controlled by the community, it's controlled by you, the user. And that's really what we're aiming to do here. And with products like the Mega Vaults, just one click, you're the liquidity provider. With instant market listings, one click again, list whatever you want. It's really just designed to give you the power to trade whatever you want.
Fantastic. And you mentioned that there's a few other changes that you want to implement into the product to make it the best perps derivatives product out there. What are some of these changes?
Yeah, so we're really focused on just the next few months right now. But in those few months, the biggest thing that we're focused on is a lot of quality improvements, both to the product, to the underlying infrastructure, making it the most performant, giving consistency to the order book, which is something traders have been asking for, and making a number of improvements to the front end to things like onboarding. So right now, it takes on the order of minutes to deposit to dYdX. We're about to release something where you can deposit in seconds from any chain, making the deposit flow a lot more reliable. And these are just things that we've heard as huge feedback from our users, and we're really responding to that. The other thing that's coming pretty soon from a product perspective that I'm personally really excited about is a much simpler version of dYdX. And it still is exactly the same protocol under the hood. But one of my big theses has been, hey, can we expand the amount of users that are trading perpetuals by an order of magnitude or two? And I think it's actually really possible to create a relatively simpler trading experience that still is every bit as powerful, still has all the same features, but just is targeted at a relatively more retail type of user. And it's not all the way down the retail spectrum. It's not your friend who bought their first Bitcoin yesterday, but it is something where the current perpetuals products, whether they're centralized or decentralized, are really complicated. Like if you go on a dYdX or a Hyperliquid or a Binance, all the products pretty much look the same. It's like there's tons of order types. There's lots of mumbo jumbo about leverage and tick size and all this kind of stuff, and funding rates. And it just gets pretty confusing. So can we take that down, really streamline the user experience, make it mobile first, and make that accessible to just many more users? And I think that's a really worthwhile experiment to do and something I am really excited about. And that'll be coming soon.
All right, let's get into the Agent TCP IP. I read over this. I get it. I definitely get it. But can you guys explain it one more time about how it's going to work?
It's like, I did my homework, but I'm kidding. Yeah, so I'm gonna try and keep it as ELI5 as possible. So when it comes to transferring something between two parties, there's two types of assets, right? If I send you 10 USDC, you can do whatever the hell you want with those 10 USDC, right? If I send you even a house, if I sell you a house, you can do whatever you want with the house because it's now completely your property. When it comes to IP, things are a little bit more complex because I could give you access to my IP under certain conditions, under certain terms, right? For a limited time. And I expect something back, for example, a percentage of revenue share, an upfront cost. And so just having pure transactions, standard transactions, is not enough to represent that, right? So think of it as like a transaction on steroids. And Agent TCP IP is trying to, actually outlines a standardized model around which this transaction on steroids can happen. And the very core principle of it is two parties, in this case, two agents, negotiate on terms. And the way that they can do it efficiently is that these terms are programmable, right? And easy to reason in for AI agents. And we actually have like a prepackaged training data that agents can take and absorb, and they'll automatically, like in the Matrix, be upskilled to know the programmable terms. Once they negotiate on a specific set of programmable terms, then the terms are codified and a license is minted. And so there's trace of what was agreed on and by who. And if there's any payment required, the payment occurs, but that's like an optional detail. And then the data is transacted on or passed over based on those certain conditions. Now, the reason why story especially lends itself well to agents, and this is another potentially hot take that Jason may not agree with, but is I think agents are better suited for story than humans. Because if you think about licensing in general, unless you have unless you're really good at remembering everything and remembering, oh, I licensed 10 different pieces of IP and these were the different terms, even if I programmatically queried all of them and I know that they're pretty much similar, as a human, I still need to remember, especially if I'm an independent creator, what the terms are, what the limitations of my usage are. The cool thing about agents is that they excel in absorbing a ton of knowledge and keeping track of it, right? And so imagine a swarm of agents transacting with one another and transacting on IP at different levels of the hierarchy. So like I'm licensing a remix of someone else's IP, and they can keep track of millions of different terms effortlessly, and so that's not a limiting factor, right? I think this is where even on the human side, I think more and more people will lean on agents to help them with this sort of with these sort of tasks. So even if the licensing aspect is completely streamlined with story, I still might want to use an agent because it's going to simplify remembering what I need to abide by, remembering when I when the yearly schedule to pay my royalties is. And so we're also working on building like a story agent to act as as someone that you can delegate your IP related tasks to. And not just humans, but also agents themselves. So agents will have the option of training themselves on it and transacting directly, or leaning on some form of story agent. And again, this is like completely work in progress. So, but that's the idea: is to have a purpose-built agent for that.
That makes sense. And with the Agent TCP IP, is this what you guys are collaborating with Eliza and Zerabra, etc. on with, or is this just part of it and there's other stuff coming in as well? I'm basically trying to ask is like, so agents can use the TCP IP, but additionally they can just also use story protocol in general as well, right? Like the contributors can take data from story protocol and
Yeah, I'll also let you chime in, but the way I would frame Agent TCP IP in the whole realm of story is Agent TCP IP outlines a specific way in which an agent-to-agent transaction around IP can take place. But a large part of what happens in the transaction is a story-related operation, which is registering IP if it doesn't already exist, associating specific terms, and minting an agreement on those terms, right? And that's what we've been building for the last 2 years, right? So even though Agent TCP IP seems like a pretty recent thing, it actually leans on a lot of prior work. And then story can be obviously used agent to human, human to agent, human to human, and so I would see Agent TCP as like a subset of story.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's like story is the underlying framework, and Agent TCP IP is sort of an interface for agent-to-agent transactions on story. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a funnel, but it is certainly relying on story and is a subset of the things that you can do on story.
That makes sense. For royalties and revenue, how is that distributed out? It also sounds like there's some parent dynamic over there, can you guys also expand on that? Because Andrea, you mentioned that if I get somebody else's royalty, like if I pay for somebody's IP and then I remix it, then I can sell that and people would pay me. How would that system work out?
Yeah, so with royalties, just to take a step back and understand how they're structured on story, basically one of the reasons why, or one of the areas where we had to do the most customization in terms of building this layer one, is thinking about how economic commitments and relationships are structured between IP as opposed to, let's say, currency transactions. the way that IP is typically structured, and this is more of an empirical point than anything else, is that they're typically structured in a graph-like way. So if you try to represent them in a database, it kind of looks like a graph with nodes and edges. And the best example I think most people understand that I can give is like, think about Super Smash Brothers, which is, obviously very popular, very fun game. We have it at the office, but basically there's Mario that you can fight with Mario, Bowser, but you can also fight with Sega characters like Sonic, or you can bring in people from, characters from many different franchises to compete in Super Smash Brothers, right? And so if you had to represent that on story, what would that look like? Well, the game itself would be a node. It would be like a circle in this graph. And then each of the 30 to 50 characters would be their own node as well, but then they would be linked as parents or a source IPs for the Super Smash Brothers game, right? So now you have this like dot with like 30 dots above it that all connect. But imagine on chain, you can have recursive situations. So each of those 30 parents can have their own parents, right? So maybe each of those 30 parents has their own two parents that they're derived from. And so if Super Smash Bros. As a game generates revenue, revenue moves in on one node of this graph, but it needs to flow to every single subsequent node, right? And if you have this tree or this graph that is exponentially growing, because at each level you have more and more parents, with different types of terms, they're not necessarily all the same terms, right? So you might pay more for one character than for the other. That character itself may have 5 commitments to other IPs that are each different from each other, and so you have this like essentially computationally explosive graph traversal problem. So that's a lot of the work that we've done on the engineering side is to structure that so that it is like actually very cheap and very scalable. And the way that a royalty module works is that every single IP is an atomic sovereign unit on story, and it declares how much it needs to receive in recurring revenues in order for someone to initially use it. And so essentially whenever revenue flows into that graph, we simply read every step, every connection that node has, right? So that node might owe IPA like 20%, it might owe IPB 30%, right? And then we just sort of distribute the funds on chain in that way. And then you go one layer above, and that IP, that IPB that got 20% might have its own commitments upstream of it, right? So that's kind of how it works, is you have this sort of almost waterfall effect where revenue flows through the graph. No matter where it enters, it will find its level, essentially. So that's kind of how it's structured, and obviously there's details to that. And then last point I'll add is, obviously when it comes to Web 2 applications, we need to fiat on-ramp, and that's something that we are working on. But ultimately, I think that's an area where we're actually trying to bring a lot of revenue on chain. So I think this will be good for the space where eventually, if YouTube integrates, like a lot of that revenue for creators on YouTube that are using story will actually eventually flow on chain, right? And it may move off chain if the creators choose to, but I think that's kind of a good onboarding tactic to kind of increase the TVL of the space.
That makes sense. One question is, let's say I buy IP off Andrea, but I don't want to pay him, or I just don't have money. Do I need to put on some collateral to make sure that, like, from what you said, it sounds like I need to hold some form of collateral that can be slashed or cut in case like I don't have enough money or I miss a payment, right?
It depends on the licensing terms. It depends on the terms of the IP. So some IP, and this is completely up to the owner of the IP to set. So you can set upfront. If you're afraid of use cases like that, then you would set an upfront payment to use the IP, and to obtain a license, you would have to pay, right? And that's kind of like automatically enforced. For, as Jason was saying, like off chain, let's say you build a really cool character that's registered on story, and I fall in love with it, and I want to create a t-shirt line or something, right? A swag line, or I want to use it in some IRL use. Then I would mint a license for it, and I would be legally obliged to share, if the terms dictate, a certain percentage back to you, right? So let's say I make $100,000 in sales, and I need to pay you 10%, then I would need to send you 10,000. This is where the enforcement, if you like, there's no perfect way to solve enforcement, like you can't solve it in the real world. But the terms that are created on story, even though they're programmable, are actually codified in a legally binding document that has been created with the help of several legal teams, and so it is legally binding and legally enforceable in the real world. much like any other form of IP agreement. So if someone licenses it and makes money and doesn't pay you back, then it's the same thing as if I gave you permission to use my logo and you made T-shirts and you never paid me back. So one way to look at it is Story is not trying to build walls to make it like we're trying to break down walls and make it easier for honest actors that legitimately want to use IP and give back to the creators of the IP and actually have a self-sustaining economy around IP, do so. Similar to how we went from the default being going to stream something or torrenting something to just watching it on legitimate platforms, because the path of least resistance was to do the right thing. Right. Right now, people don't do the right thing because it's the more complicated way to do it. Right. If I want to legally license something, it's a pain in the ass. It's a big friction point. If I can just click a button and have it licensed, I'm much more inclined to do it because I know I'm going to save myself a ton of headache. Right. Imagine if a ghostwriter was able to seamlessly in one click license Drake's voice when he created "Heart on My Sleeve," right, which became like a super top streamed song on Spotify, but ended up being taken down because he didn't get a license for Drake's voice, even though he used an AI model to generate Drake's voice on that song. This is not utopia. Like Grimes followed up quickly after saying, if anyone wants to do something like that, please do, and just give me 50%. So there is appetite on IP holders to let their IP flourish, but there's just until now, there's been no way to do that in a scalable way.
That makes sense. One thing you mentioned, Jason, is onboarding capital. Are you guys thinking of exporting IP to other chains for it to be traded? I know that you want IP-Fi on. I assume you also want IP-Fi on Story as well. But is it something that you're thinking of? Like, if there are purpose-built trading chains, would it make sense to export IP to be traded on those, or is that something that you're not considering?
So it's a good question. So the way that we think about it is our ambition is to build a core protocol for the internet in the same way that, domain name system or HTTP, no one's like a big fan of HTTP, right? It's so prevalent that it's just used, right? So you don't see people wearing like, I'm a big domain name system supporter. I'm so glad the domain name system exists. So I think that we want to strive to that level of adoption. And if that is to be true, even to a 1% or any approximation of that vision, we have to support as many different computing environments as possible. And the way that we think about it is, it's not, can we support other blockchains? It's actually, if you're off chain, right? Like that's also important, right? Most IP isn't even on chain. So that's kind of the first order of business. And so the way that we build solutions we're building solutions where if your IP is on, let's say it's on Optimism, let's say it's on, Solana, or let's say it's on Aptos, we treat it the same way as if it were off chain, right? Essentially, it's not on Story. So how do we bring it onto Story? So we basically have the same approach in both cases, which is your IP can live anywhere. Wherever you are, we will meet you there, right? We don't want to be a distribution platform. We don't want to be like a social media platform where you have to be on Story in order to get the benefits. Your IP is, we meet you where you are, right? So for most people, that's off chain, but then if you're on Solana, you're kind of off Story as well, right? So we kind of treat you the same way. And essentially what we want to do is allow people to create intellectual property anywhere, but then where it's settled and where it's being transacted is Story. So in the same way that, any application uses, probably any modern application is going to use 5 to 10 different services. You can imagine the applications of the future leveraging Story for their IP, and then maybe they'll use another blockchain for payments. Maybe they'll use something else for identity. But I think Story will be this sort of universal horizontal layer that scales across industries, scales across applications, and also scales across blockchains. So we don't want to be sort of parochial in our view towards other blockchains, but I would say we treat anything that's not on Story as off Story, and we have a sort of standardized approach to that.
That makes sense. What front ends are being built on Story protocol? That's something you mentioned, is that there are teams working on you guys building out front ends.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing is we've built a sort of a public good. It's not meant to be a killer app or anything, but it's meant to sort of offer a central place for people to access story if it's their first time. So it's called the IP portal. It's going to come out like shortly after our public mainnet. But the idea is, if you don't know how to code, if you are, someone who holds IP, you can easily register IP in a very consumer-friendly no-code way, set your terms, and it's now available on any application that's plugged into Stories API, right? So 50 to 100 applications instantly for free. And then also you can browse. So a lot of people ask, okay, well, what type of IP is on Story? On the portal, you can browse all the IP on Story and see the terms and the lineage, the genealogy of how it's related to every other IP. And then also, if you are an IP holder, you can manage your revenue. You can collect all the revenue that you've earned, all the yield that you've earned, so to speak, from your assets across the many different applications that may be using them. So it's sort of like a one-stop shop, but that's just sort of one application. It's a very simple application, to be honest. We see probably 3 or 4 categories of apps. The first is what I would call like creator tools. So an example of this would be Magma. They're a fully Web 2 application. They have 2.5 million creators per year, 10 million IPs registered per year. And it's essentially like a collaborative art making platform. So it's almost like Figma, but for visual artists. And every single asset that's registered on Magma can be registered on Story by default. So that's like a huge supply of assets to Story. And for Magma, it's great because they can tell their creators, like, we're giving you 500, not 500 yet, but like 50 to 100 distribution channels for your IP to be used instantly. So it's kind of no risk. And then there's sort of like creator tools, consumer platforms. The second is IPFi. So like DeFi applications. We have applications where you can create IP-backed meme coins, IP RWAs. I mentioned Justin Bieber's Peaches. We have fractionalization protocols, things like that, as well as lending protocols where you can use IP as collateral. So, and then there's also another sort of IPFi application that's pretty cool where you can actually stake on IPs. And the idea is that you talked about a bounty, right? It's basically other people attesting, hey, I believe this IP is legitimate. And if it's not, they get slashed. But if it is, they can continue to earn yield, right? So there's sort of like economic primitives that can increase a signal around an IP asset in a way that the government or no centralized entity simply can, right? So there's like this whole section of IPFi that's really exciting. And then we have a lot of AI-powered applications, right? So this can be anything from foundation model companies to the agents Andrea was talking about to even applications like Ablo, which is a sort of AI-powered fashion remixing app that's been built on Story. They've actually partnered with Balmain, Balenciaga, Polo, some of the world's largest brands, and you can use AI to kind of customize your shoe and create new shoes. And so people can create new Balmain shoes. If those are successful, they get printed or made, I should say, and the revenue is shared with Ablo, the creator, as well as a brand, all via Story, right? So I think there's a lot of different applications, and we'll see a lot more continue to pop up. But our goal is, not only incubate sort of the next generation of consumer applications and IP-related applications, but also to integrate with some of the existing massive distribution channels like the Netflix, YouTubes, Twitters of the world. I mean, that's ultimately our goal. So that's where we want to go with our ecosystem.
Perfect. Last question. You already talked about onboarding on Story, so I'm not going to ask that. But do you see centralized competitors being an issue? And I don't mean like centralized competitors in the real world. I mean centralized competitors on the blockchain, like Sonium. So I don't know if I'm saying that right, Sonium. Or if like other, I guess, semi-IP related blockchains pop up. Do you think how are you guys going to work on that? Or are you just going to assume that's like off-chain as well? We're just going to take their IP.
Yeah, so I think what Sony is doing is really interesting. I think Sony is very forward-facing there, but ultimately, I think I kind of have the same reaction. It's complementary to Story in the same way that, I think Deutsche Bank announced that they were going to build a layer 2 on ZK Sync, and I don't think anyone thinks that Deutsche Bank's L2 is going to replace Ethereum or Solana as the settlement layer for payments. So I see it as one instance that proves that there is interest, but I don't see it as a real competitor to our peer-to-peer IP system. I see it as a sort of traction that we can use and hopefully work together. Because ultimately, I think our goal is to reduce the amount of essentially transaction taxation and transaction costs that we have to suffer as a society because our ideas and our research and our creativity is basically held and arbitrated by like a few entities, right? So ultimately, I don't think it's going to be one of those entities that exists today that creates that system because it is utterly destructive to their business model and it reduces their value capture by a lot, right? So in the same way that Ethereum isn't really probably threatened by, if Goldman Sachs started a blockchain or something, like I think we feel that way about, some of these sort of like big companies coming onto crypto. But I mean, obviously it's a good thing for the space. So hopefully we can find a way to work together.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I feel like a lot of these complementary networks are creating potentially IP focused chains or IP inspired chains, right? Like Sonium obviously has access to a lot of IP, but they're less focused on creating a transacting layer for IP exchange. They're more, how do we bring IP on chain? And so totally agree with Jason that it's a very complementary type of approach, right? So like if Sonium brings on a ton of IP and suddenly tokenizes it, a story is going to be the perfect layer on which to create terms on it, like to really add that API for that specific IP that's brought on chain, regardless of whether it's on story or not.
Yeah, I think IP can live anywhere, and it should just be settled on story.
Fantastic. I said that was the last question, but I want to ask actually one more. Where do you guys see? Because IP is such a, like, I'll be honest, I mostly do DeFi and gaming stuff, so IP is very far away from me. So I want to get like your honest take on where do you see IP in crypto and blockchain over the next 2 years or 3 years? Like, do you think we catch on very, very quickly, or do you see there being kind of a bumpy ride?
Can I take a quick stab at this? So actually, I'm going to focus on your preamble to this question, which is you said, I'm usually in DeFi and gaming, and so IP is very far from me. I think an ideal goal within the next year or two is you become as familiar with IP in the way that you need to be, not that you need to know everything about IP, but you feel it as easy and seamless to interact with as you do a DeFi protocol or as you do a game, right? Because if you think about it, financial being DeFi a native was a very far concept, 10 years ago for most people, unless you worked on very specialized industries. Now everyone can be a trader. Everyone can be a DeFi expert if they just spend 10 minutes, because there's so much infrastructure making it easy, making it approachable. And we want to do the same thing for IP, not in the sense that everyone should learn everything about IP and become an IP lawyer, right? That's not what we're trying to do. Much like you don't need to know about what happens in the inner workings of a DeFi protocol, but we want everyone to be able to be a user of an IP protocol, right? Feel like anything that they create is good enough to be an IP. Whether or not it has value, that's up to the market to kind of determine. But you shouldn't think of, my stuff is, creating an IP is like this whole thing with lawyers and super expensive, and I'm not going to think about it. Like, the default behavior should be anything you create, anything that comes out of a creative mind is IP and should be registered as IP. And we want to make it as easy as possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Andrea said is interesting because IP is everywhere. It just isn't, it's sort of like not a construct that people have explicitly in their head, so they don't really see it, right? Because you see how you frame the world, and the way you frame the world shapes what you see. And I think, for example, like the way I see this cycle is that the three most exciting trends in the space is number one, AI and agents. Number two, it's meme coins. And number three, it's RWAs, right? And like in every single vertical, I just see IP all over that because that's what I'm looking for, right? I think that AI, like IP is this core input into AI. We talked about that extensively. Meme coins, like, that's just extremely obvious, right? Like with the chill guy stuff, the problems are obvious too, but obviously like what is a meme? It's literally like a mimetic IP. It's an internet native IP. And then RWAs, you can see what we've done with Justin Bieber's Peaches. It's actually like this, the problem with a lot of RWAs is like, why would I want a T-bill on chain? I just, it's like kind of like, it's just not that interesting, right? Because you can access anyone in the world can access T-bills. The entire world economy operates on American debt, right? So it's not like this sort of rare, scarce asset. Whereas people are dying to get into this Justin Bieber asset because like, where else are you going to be able to access or democratize this thing that, even your mom would understand why it's valuable, and everyone wants to kind of have financial exposure to that, right? So to me, I see IP everywhere. It's like already kind of lurking underneath, and our job is just to make sure it's explicit. And then, I think that the way they see story scaling is kind of like, what is the other product in crypto that has true PMF? It's stablecoins. And how do stablecoins work, right? The way that they work is they borrow the legitimacy of an existing institution, that is the US dollar, and then they make it 20x better, right? So stablecoins are just so much easier to use than US dollars when it comes to international payments, when it comes to censorship resistance, when it comes to being able to access like a whole programmable ecosystem of financial applications. Same thing with story, right? Like, it's not like we're trying to usurp the existing legal system. We're borrowing the legitimacy and the power of that legal system, but then we're making it 100x better by bringing it on chain. And I think that's like, if we want to see, I think that the next few years, I mean, it's maybe doesn't sound too long, but it is a decent amount of time. And ultimately, to me, like the best way to onboard like real people into crypto is not to improve the UX. Like no one actually cares about UX. If you think you can yield farm whatever 500% APY, you will click all the buttons, you will read all the terms and conditions, you will go watch YouTube, like you will get there, right? What the thing that crypto lacks is it doesn't motivate people to use crypto. Like people are motivated to do really bad UX and jump through a lot of hoops if they want something. But like most of crypto doesn't inspire people to want something. And I think what IP is something that everyone cares about and everyone understands. And so I really do see it as like the sort of intersection with traditional institutions. I see it as intersection with AI. So I think we'll start to see a lot more people like stability and perhaps even governments come in through this pain point of IP, right? And then we can argue about, once people want to do something, then we can argue about whether the UX is good enough. But right now, I think the problem isn't UX. It's like outside of money, like people don't want anything in crypto. So this is bringing an entirely new thing to the table that can inspire people to jump through the hoops that they might have to jump through to use on-chain systems.
Fantastic. Guys, before we head off, where can my listeners go to learn more about Story, and what should they do? What should they be looking forward to over the next?
Yeah, so definitely the biggest milestone is our public mainnet launch, which is coming up really, really soon. I can't really give a specific date, but you won't have to wait long. And we're really excited for that. Obviously, we've been working for that for 3 years, but for us, that's just the starting line. It's not the finish. It's actually just very much the beginning. So there's going to be a lot of awesome applications ready on day one, but also much more exciting stuff to come. And in terms of where to find us, we have, if you're a developer, our docs, we update them like every week, thanks to Andrea and his team. So they're very, very live. If you have questions, we have a very extensive frequently asked questions. So
if you're an agent, we have a page for you.
Yeah, we have made our documentation easily consumable to agents. So we have like a file that you can train your agents on. So if you're a developer, start there, and then you can always reach out to Andrea, who supports a lot of developers. And then for people who are interested in using Story as an IP holder or just part of the community, our Twitter is probably the best place to get live information. And we have an ecosystem page on our website, story.foundation/ecosystem, where you can start to dive into the applications.
Fantastic. Guys, thank you so much for coming on. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, thanks for having us.